Okay, in this tutorial, I'm going to discuss 7 possible solutions to the problem of land degradation. And these are all solutions that are taken from the Sahel region of Africa, and they're all used in various places with the aim of either reducing the loss of soil or improving people's lives due to the loss of soil. And they all work in different ways. And what I'll do is I'll sort of describe each technique to you. I'll kind of explain how it works, what particular aspect of land degradation it helps manage or solve. And I'll also give you some evaluative ideas, because this particular exam question often comes with the requirement of having to evaluate the solutions, considering whether they work or don't work, or a combination of both. So let's start with terracing the landscape. So terracing the landscape is when you've got a gradient, the first thing you want to do is flatten that gradient into a series of small flat areas of land, strips of land created through these terraces, which are effectively like little steps in the landscape. Between each step, there's a small little soil wall known as a bund. And what you're doing by flattening the landscape is you are reducing the flow of water when it rains across this landscape. So if this was a continual slope, downward slope, when it rains, the water would rapidly run down this surface and it would wash the topsoil away very rapidly, leading to soil erosion. By creating these small steps, what you do is you flatten the landscape. You therefore slow down the movement of water, which reduces the amount of soil erosion. And you also retain that water behind the small bunds, that's B-U-N-D-S, which means that any soil that has been washed from an upper layer is trapped behind the little small soil wall. So you're retaining the topsoil on your slope, you're creating a flatter landscape, and you're reducing the amount of soil erosion, and that allows you to then cultivate this landscape. Now, whilst this works at reducing soil erosion, it's very labor intensive to create and maintain, especially if you have a particularly strong wet season. You can imagine a lot of these small walls will get washed away. So there's a continual process of repair required in this landscape, and it's very labor intensive, and often the whole community has to come in to help restore the landscape every year after the rainy season. So there's solution number 1, terraces. The second solution has got multiple ways of working, and I'll give you talk about 2 of them. And it's to do with female education and the diversification of economic activity. So let's just look at each of these in separate turns and why women are so central to solving the problems of land degradation. So one of the biggest causes of land degradation is population pressure in these areas, where increasing populations is leading to more land having to be intensively cultivated all year long to produce food to feed the growing populations. So obviously a key to reducing that is to reduce population pressure. So if you want to tackle land degradation, then one of the solutions is to actually reduce birth rates, fertility rates. So to do that, you want to educate women about contraception and family planning, and getting to understand the virtues of having smaller family sizes, and how actually it will mean they don't have to cultivate the land as intensively, which obviously is one of the problems of land degradation. The over-farmed land, eventually the soil degrades. So female education is seen as one of the solutions there. And it is working certainly in many areas of Africa where programs introduced by the United Nations have effectively seen fertility rates drop. It is obviously very expensive and it takes time. And one of the problems is it often flies against traditional culture, which encourages large family sizes. Also, many of these women will be having many children to work on these farms, because a lot of the work in African farms is very labor intensive, so they'll have large families for that reason. So a second solution that goes hand in hand with an increase in female education has to be the introduction of kind of what we call intermediary technologies. So for example, giving these families basic plow and enhanced pieces of equipment to work the land, which reduces the requirement for large families, possibly introducing the idea of using oxen or buffalo to pull the plows, which speeds up the process of plowing and weeding the land. It's some basic, and I say intermediate technologies. They're intermediary technologies because they're not high tech. They're not like the types of technologies you'd see our farmers use, They're not computerized, and they're generally not very mechanical, so they're easy to be taught and use for these people in these local communities. The third solution, and it works in hand with the first two, it's not just about reducing family sizes and starting to introduce technology into farming, which also encourages families to be smaller, but actually diversifying the activity that families are engaged in. So these women have all been, in Nigeria, have been educated in basket weaving, and they're using local raw materials, and they're being trained by this woman in the center. These younger women have been trained on how to make these baskets, and these baskets are then being sold in the cities and sold internationally. So the family incomes are increasingly coming from other activities, not just from farming the land, which means the land doesn't have to be farmed as intensively anymore to generate the income and food for the family, because there are other income revenues that these women can rely on because they now have the skills. So these are often funded by large international charities. That's one of the problems there, is that these programs are initially reliant on outside sources of income, and are difficult for these relatively impoverished governments to set up themselves. However, one of the advantages is these programs are often then self-sustaining, because these women will start teaching other women in their communities, and gradually over time they don't need outside sources of income to help them, educate them, train them in these other skills. But clearly, how does it solve land degradation? Because the women are earning income from other things, and therefore they're not over-farming the land as much because they don't need to. And therefore land degradation is reduced. So there's solution number two. Solution number three is probably one of the largest solutions to land degradation seen anywhere in the world. It's called, well, the idea is reforestation. In Africa, it's called the Great Green Wall Initiative, that you can see up here. And the idea is to plant millions of trees across this belt just south of the Sahara in the Sahel. And here you can see a picture of some of the land that's been reforested compared to this land over here, which has not been reforested. So the idea of reforestation in the Sahel is that trees, first of all, they help reduce rain splash because they intercept the rain. They also retain about 50% of the moisture in the land, so they keep the land wetter, they keep the soil wetter, and therefore it's less likely to blow away in the dry season. They also act as a shelter belt, so when a dust storm blows across this landscape, the trees actually collect that soil that's blowing and trap it. And the root systems themselves also reduce the erosion from the rain and from the wind, because they help bind the soil together. So for multiple reasons, the Green Wall Initiative has been highly successful in reclaiming land that's been lost to the desert. One of the drawbacks is that the competing forces for this wood are the local populations, who are continually deforesting trees shortly after they've been planted. The increasing populations of the Sahel region, it creates a huge demand for firewood, and therefore these lands have to be patrolled pretty regularly in order to stop local communities continually cutting back the trees that have been recently planted. Another slight criticism of the project is it's extremely expensive and reliant on money from international agencies, which has to continually flow into this region because the governments themselves can't afford the costs of reforesting on a scale which is currently being proposed, which is literally billions of trees need planted across the Sahel in order to repair the damage that's been done. So that's reforestation. Right, now down to a couple of traditional techniques. So these are really good to use in an exam because you're naming traditional techniques. These are techniques that have been seen in Burkina Faso. Actually, they've been used recently as part of a pilot project in Takabangu village. Once again, using these kinds of details in any exam answer is really positive. So the first of these solutions is what's called the ZAI, Z-A-I. And you can see farmers digging a small hole. There's a picture of a small hole that's been dug. Then generally they will use some animal dung and they'll put it into that hole. And the soil that you can see that's dug out is actually put around the edge. It becomes a little shelter wall. So when the wind blows in this direction, if it's got sand or soil, topsoil blowing in it, the little wall will trap that soil and it will then get deposited into the hole on top of the animal dung. And then come planting season, they will plant the crops in these small holes, which will be much richer because of the animal dung and the topsoil that's been trapped behind the small wall that was built. Okay, so that solution is the Zai. Another one, the degradation, are sometimes known as magic stones, and these are small stone walls that are built, and you can see a diagram here of them being built. How they work is they're built along the contours of the land, you can see here, and they trap soil that's being washed off a hillside when it rains, or when it blows, the topsoil will get trapped behind these small walls. And you can see the impact up in this photograph up here of how the wind that's been blowing this way has all the topsoil's got trapped behind the small degradation here, and it starts to build up on this side, and therefore they've started to plant this side, and grass has started to grow. So this land is starting to recover. Okay, so what makes these great is they're really simple to do. They don't require an awful lot of education. The simple tools are required to build them. Very little education is required. Most of it can be passed on through word of mouth. And they just use local materials. You don't need to import anything. However, there is an initial cost of bringing in the tools and the education the local people need in order to know how to do these techniques. So there is an initial cost of doing it. However, they're relatively self-sustaining once they're up and running and are having a significant impact in areas of the Sahel. So there's a little outliner for the Zai and the degradation there, and you can pause it at this point if you want to have a read through these two ideas, just to get a little bit more idea. But I think using ideas of a project in Takabangu village in Burkina Faso and talking about these two and how they work in slightly different ways at reducing land degradation. And obviously they're positive because they're not just allowing the land to recover, but they're allowing farmers to grow crops again. Right, let's move on to fallow band farming. So this is a technique that's being used in Niger at the moment, around the town of Niamey, which you can see there, which is in Niger. How does fallow band farming work? Well, this diagram will show you how it works. So in the first year, during the rainy season, the farmer plants their maize crop, you can see here, but they create a 5-meter break between the crop where they just allow rough grass to grow. They don't plant anything else. Okay, so they don't cultivate this area. During the dry season, these small hummocks of grass that were growing, they've obviously cut the maize down, they effectively now act as barriers to wind erosion. They will start to trap the topsoil that's blowing. So it will start to build up around this grass that's been planted. Come year 2, during the rainy season, you can see they've now planted maize here, which was the area that was fallow the year before. And you'll see the maize is growing bigger. And that's because the topsoil has built up and trapped around this area and it wasn't cultivated the year before. A new fallow band has been created, not in the same location as the previous one. Come the dry season of the second year, you can see that the area that was fallow during the rainy season is now becoming the area that traps the topsoil as it blows across the surface. And now you've got a much wider area that is now growing more. So you're getting more crop from a bigger area. So in year 2, it was only about a quarter of your crop. In year 3, or moving into the dry season, you're now getting a much bigger crop into year 3. And you repeat that process. About once every 4 or 5 years, you have to return to leaving this original area fallow. So you can't just have it giving a good return forever. It needs to have a period of time of fallow. Now, fallow means it's just left to rest. But instead of it being an entire field, it's just part of the field. And the reason for that part is it allows you to build up a small little hummock of land, which then acts as a small trap against the soil that's blowing across the surface during the dry season. Now, why is it successful? Well, by year 4, farmers are seeing a 75% increase in their crop yields. And that's from studies that actually have used this. And by the time you get to year 5, you're having to return to the original fallow. Now, they're still able to produce food every year. Initially, in year 1, they'll see a slight drop because they're cultivating less land. But by year 2, they start to see an increase, which will then keep on going. And as long as they keep rotating back to the original fallow stretch every fourth year, well, at the end of every fourth year, it's successful. On the negative, though, because it seems like such a great system, it does require farmer re-education. A lot of these techniques have fallen by the wayside, and farmers haven't used them for a long time and have forgotten about them, and they haven't been passed down from parents to children. And therefore, outsiders have to come in and teach farmers about these new systems and about actually how leaving a bit of your land uncultivated will actually, in the long run, lead to you being able to grow more food as well as helping the soil recover. Right, our next solution is fencing and rotational grazing. So we're starting to see more of this across Africa. Traditionally, land, like we can see here, is not owned by anybody, and farmers will just graze their herds across any land that's currently not being grazed by anybody else. And shepherds will continually move the herds on once the land has been completely grazed. The problem is if the land is completely grazed, like we can see over on the right-hand side of this picture, then the plants can actually die, the root systems disappear, and that exposes the topsoil, which allows the wind to then blow it away or water to wash it away. What farmers can start to do is by using simple fencing systems, they can start to move the animals on regularly every couple of days into a new section. So here we can see it for maybe day 1 and 2, the cattle are here, but for day 3 and 4, they'll be moved here. Day 5 and 6, they're moved over here, and you keep rotating them around the land. And you need fences, obviously, to stop the animals wandering back to the land that's already been grazed. And this gives the chance for the land to recover. Now, you need a lot of land to do this, and you can't go back to an area of land that's been grazed for quite a long period of time, in some cases months, to allow the grass to regrow. But as long as you continually move them and you protect the land that has already been grazed for a period of time, then you should allow the grass to regrow, reestablish. Another upside of this is the animals, whilst they're eating in this area, will also be going to the toilet, and all of the manure will be settling on that landscape. And as the cattle then move off, that will decompose, and all of the rich organic materials will be added to the soils. Okay. One problem, however, is this creates a lot of conflict. Farmers that use it, other farmers might not want to participate in it, and they might want to move their animals across this area of land where one farmer is using fencing systems to control their animals, and that can lead to conflict. And actually, in many places in Africa where they've started to use this, it can be quite violent conflict that involves deaths often. Another problem is farmers have got to get hold of the materials that allow them to create these fencing systems, the wooden fences and the metal barbed wire to actually restrict the animals' movement. And in many areas of Africa, that can be quite difficult to get hold of. So what a lot of farmers actually do is they use more traditional materials to create their fences. Right, our last solution is dams and irrigation systems. So this is an idea that during the wet season, when you've got a huge amount of water, what you actually want to do is trap it behind these systems of dams, which means that during the dry season, you can have a continual water supply. Now, that's important because having a continual water supply allows farmers to continually water their crops, as we can see down here in a drip irrigation system. And as long as the soil is continually wet, it's less likely to be blown away during the dry season when the soil's dried out and the winds pick up and blow the topsoil away. So if you can continually feed the land with moisture, it'll create a greater weight and will stop the soil blowing away. Now, many countries in Northern Africa have used it. Egypt's a good example. It comes at an incredible cost, though. Dams are very expensive things to engineer. The irrigation channels that need to then be built to take the water from the reservoirs we can see over here to the actual farmers' fields are also very expensive to construct. And then the irrigation system that has to then be built to allow the water to be continually supplied. This is a drip irrigation system where drips of water continually feeding the land, are all very expensive. And many of the sub-Saharan African countries don't have the level of technology, expertise, or finance to afford them. And countries that do embark on this kind of development in agriculture often have to borrow huge sums of money and get themselves into debt in the process. Okay, that is 7 different solutions, fully described, explained, and evaluated. You could use a combination of them, supported by some actual examples that I've talked about, to pick up your 10 to 12 marks even if it was a describe, explain, and evaluate question, maybe even up to 14.